Well, I'd better just explain why I got into this subject. And it may surprise you, but I was a thoroughgoing European student of European history, and in particular the history of political thought, specializing at first on the Middle Ages. And then, to be honest, I got slightly bored, and as one does at the age of about 50. And I thought, what new is there to do? All the major, etc., etc. So I thought, well, the thing to do is to ask why Europe developed as it did, which we all know was unique, as indeed all cultures are. And I thought the best way to do this was to compare the development of European thought with that of other cultures, taking up here the notions of Max Weber in particular. And the most obvious one to compare with was, of course, Islam, both because they shared a great deal in the origins, the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritage, and to some extent the Greek philosophers. And of course they were geographically contiguous, so that's why I did. And then when I came to look at Islamic political thought, there was in fact no overall history. In Western political thought there are multiple histories which are the basis of teaching, etc., from the ancient Greeks to the present. But many, many scholars, true, unlike myself, true Arabic specialists and so forth, have worked on particular periods or particular aspects of the history of Islamic political thought, but nobody had done the overall thing. So in order to make the comparison, I thought that I ought to look at the whole, because otherwise you wouldn't be comparing like with like. That's basically what it is. Could I just say, I do think history has many glories. One of them, which is perhaps not sufficiently appreciated, is just that it's so fascinating. I mean, we find the natural world fascinating, butterflies, stars, but if you look at history, we're looking at, as we all know, the most complex thing in the universe, which is the human brain. And we're looking at how the human brain has functioned throughout its time on this planet. And it's just remarkable, full of surprises. But of course also, we all know, history has a relevance to us now because the past relates to the present in various ways. In a very general way, we're all the product, obviously, of previous generations, and we're influenced by the past in ways we may not always appreciate. But with Islam, and indeed some other religions in particular, the past has a further importance, namely that people refer to it as being in some way a model, perhaps, or authoritative, and so forth. So it's doubly important to know what the past is. Now, as you probably all know, political thought only really became a separate item relatively recently, well, since the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe. It was to some extent with the ancient Greeks, but in other cultures, and in Europe before the 17th century, it was always part of religion and ethics, basically. So it specializes in the study of the exercise of power, who should exercise it, how much power various individuals have or should have, and it is, of course, about justice in the relationships between people, especially between those in power and those they rule, and it is about the just distribution of goods in society. Well, Islam was a new beginning in the history of ideas. Political thought in Islam was different from what had gone before. The foundation of Islam was a decisive break in human thinking about politics and society. when Muhammad and his followers forged a new people, Ummah, they brought into being at once a sense of Arab nationality and a new kind of international society. For the first and only time in human history, the nation was transcended at the moment it was created. At the heart of the project was the transfer of power from empire to prophet and later to the religious community. The empires, obviously, ancient Persia and the Byzantine. The new community was to be based upon the Sharia, the religious law or code, which was designed, like the Judaic law, to be all-embracing, to cover morals, what we call law, belief, ritual, marriage, commerce. Now, what happened with the rise of Islam can only be explained by seeing it as something that was, in our language, at the same time spiritual and political. One point of the early Muslims seems to me to have been that up till then, the Abrahamic monotheists had failed to come to terms with the problem of power. The Jews had at first set up a kingdom. It had been destroyed. They tried to re-establish it. They'd been defeated. They were now dispersed, and they lived as separate communities without independent political power at all. The Christians, ironically, had at the beginning rejected power altogether and said that they were not concerned with politics or the state. But then, when the emperors became Christian, they had immediately, or not all of them, but the great majority had accepted this, and there was established an empire that was actually enforcing Christianity rather than any other belief system, just about tolerating Jews, and also persecuting dissident forms of Christianity, which is one reason why I think Islam had such an appeal at first, that the populations of Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere had disagreed with the imperial form of Christianity, and they were in effect being discriminated against. So they really couldn't care less if some new people came in and took over, and the new people, the Muslims, actually tolerated them, as you well know. Muhammad and his followers, I think, set about to preach something which included the exercise of power in its revealed message. That is to say, that the only way that a revealed message could be effectively got across was if those in power believed in it, more or less. So, I would suggest that what was preached was spiritual brotherhood, plus an all-embracing law, like Judaism, plus universal political control to be achieved, if necessary, by military conquest. And of course, the conquered peoples were not, as a rule, forced to become Muslims, but they were forced to be subjects. So in that sense, there was a belief that the deity had assigned to Muslims the right to rule the whole world. But even so, people were not compelled to believe that. The Muslim people, it was said, were bound together by faith and justice, not, like the Arab tribes, by kinship. Islam, I think, revolutionized, or tried to revolutionize, tribal society by catapulting the individual into the center of social responsibility. No longer could one shelter behind the group from God. Concern for justice must override clan ties. As the Quran says, surely the noblest among you in the sight of God is the most God-fearing of you. The new religion and its law instilled a social identity which bound people together and cut them off or carved them off from outsiders. A strong sense of belonging and at the same time a clear-cut distinction between members and non-members. Now, contrary to what is sometimes said today, jihad was pretty important. And one thing it did was to emphasize the fraternity among males, and it, of course, underwrote the distinction between insiders and outsiders. Fighting unbelievers and killing idolaters, even if they were not the aggressors, was sometimes said to be religious duties. And a surprising proportion of hadith, the narratives about what the Prophet was alleged to have said or done, concerned the conduct of battle and the division of spoils. And we find in later Islamic history, I think a little bit more than in other cultures, success in jihad, or in other words, in expansion of the state or of the boundaries and exploitation of material and human resources, was what counted as a good rule. And it was often decisive in creating and preserving Islamic dynasties. When dynasties begin to suffer defeat, they usually get toppled. Witness the Ottomans. But the other great innovation was the introduction into the Abrahamic tradition of a degree of toleration. The pagan Roman Empire had tolerated all religions and none, provided they recognized the emperor. The Christian Empire, as I've said, had persecuted first pagans, then Jews, then dissident Christians. The unity of the Ummah emerges as a fundamental social norm. And the Islamic community was supposed to be different from the Christian, which also, of course, aspired to be universal, by its harmonious unity and the absence of doctrinal disputes, because the Christians had become entangled in disputes about the nature of the Trinity, to what extent Jesus was God, etc., etc. Very, to us, or to some people, very obscure theological disputes, but these had created enormous divisions. And so you find, I think, in the Quran sayings that, you know, you're not to be like these people who go in for all these disputes and divisions. So what was the problem? Well, I suggest the problem lay precisely in the area of political organization and order. I mean by problem that which created divisions within the Ummah. It was the first real problem to emerge. The first Muslims, as is perfectly clear from the early history, the early recorded narratives, immediately, practically, upon the death of the Prophet, almost immediately became divided as to how his successor should be chosen and who he should be. So this, I think, underlines to me the extent to which this was supposed to be a faith which was concerned with the exercise of power, with who holds power. And what is extraordinary, considering the political aspect of Islam, was that there was no written document and no oral tradition from the Prophet about how power should be wielded, by whom, or in what way. And one could say that Muslims have been paying a price for this ever since. What we find in the early text are two things. First, a considerable emphasis on obedience, as it says in the Quran, "O believers, obey God and obey the messenger and those in authority among you. If you should quarrel on anything, refer it to God and the messenger." Doesn't say what you do when the messenger is no longer there. Second, we do find the famous text about speaking out against injustice, Hisbah, or as it says somewhere, I'm sorry I haven't got the quotation, the source, the most excellent jihad is the uttering of truth in the presence of an unjust ruler. So you are supposed to stand up for justice. So there is a political element there. These divisions were the origin not only of the main rival branches of Islam throughout history and today, the Sunni and the Shia, but of many other small sects, some of which lasted for centuries, the Ismailis, for example, which all also defined themselves in reference to the caliphate. Well, there were various responses to this issue, which we'll be looking at. The first was the default position of every human society, namely monarchy. Possibly absolute, but it could never be quite absolute because any ruler in the Muslim community would have to respect the Sharia, but otherwise, absolute monarchy. That was one alternative. The second alternative was, I think, the one which more or less prevailed, namely the development of a legal system known as the Sharia, which purported to define all these questions. The juristic mode we'll be looking at in the next talk. The third alternative was philosophy, i.e. to discuss in supposedly rational terms who should rule, why, what they should do, etc., what we do call political thought, which we'll also be looking at later on. But first now, because this was what first emerged, as you see in this wonderful coin from the Umayyads, was in effect what we call patrimonial monarchy, by which we mean a system of government in which the ruler regards the state, does this sound familiar, as his or his family's benefice, from on high, of course. And the people are his clients under his protection, and he can distribute patronage to whom he wishes. His powers are not subject to constitutional rules or the people at large, only to the unwritten obligations of fatherly beneficence. And this includes the duty and the right to manage the economy for the benefit of the people. I say this was the default position because every other society practically in the world adopted this position, and there were departures from it, but they were relatively rare. The civil wars in early Islam, in the later 7th century and indeed the 8th century, also encouraged absolutism because it seemed to be the best solution. As they say, better 100 years of injustice than one day of anarchy. That was a proverb of the time. Further, the original Arabian heritage of Islam very quickly became combined with an important Iranian heritage, which was precisely patrimonial monarchy of the old Sasanian dynasty. And you very quickly find that Sasanian rulers, the good ones that is, are quoted as good examples of how you should behave, often beside hadith. Somebody will say, you should be severe on the wicked and merciful to the good, as it says in this hadith and as it says, is reported of this ancient pre-Islamic Persian monarch. So that all took place. I refer to this in the words of a modern poem as the road not taken, because Islam, I think, could have, well, theoretically, could have developed in that way, or a new culture could, but it didn't. The Umayyads, of course, as you know, gained power very quickly after the first and second civil wars. Then they were overthrown by the Abbasids, who then ruled effectively for 200 years and as caliphs for about 700. So it was very quickly they combined the Arabo-Islamic with the monarchical ideas taken over from Persia, from ancient Persia. Of course, the right to rule was also, and this is slightly ironical, usually based on some claim to kinship with the Prophet. The Abbasids claimed to be descended from, I think, the Prophet's uncle. And as you probably know, several kings in the world today make this claim. I believe, I've been told, the King of Jordan and the King of Morocco. Maybe that's why the Arab Spring didn't get there. But anyway, now, as soon as we start talking about the caliphate, we come to the question of Sunnis and Shia. Both these terms, as they were used subsequently, were non-existent, or at least they didn't mean the same in the early 2 or 3 centuries quite. Sunnism, as I'm sure most of you know, developed gradually, as we'll see next time, with the development of the legal system, the orthodox jurisprudence, the consensus of the jurists. That was Sunnism, or as it also called itself, I believe, the people of the community and the tradition. Al-Sunnah, the tradition. This evolved gradually over about 200 years. But some who later became Shiites took a different view, and they placed much more emphasis on the person of the caliph, on the importance of the individual who was to be, or ought to be, caliph. Of course, the first thing was that they held he should be chosen in a different way, and actually in a much more kinship-related way. What later became the Sunnis thought the caliph should be elected by a council of elders, which happened, you know, in amongst the first 4 rightly guided caliphs, I think, more or less. The Shiites held that the Prophet had designated Ali to be his successor, who was, of course, not only of outstanding merit, but also a close relation. And later on, they then said Ali had designated somebody else, and that all went by designation right down until the time of the 12th Imam, and all this time, the Shiites were being pretty fiercely persecuted by the majority. They decided it was safer if he disappeared. And in the 10th century, the 12th Imam was said to have disappeared. And in what they call the greater absence, his authority ceased to be visible. And there were various opinions about to what extent he transmitted his authority to jurists, to the leaders of the Shiite community, and so forth. But we'll see that Shiism underwent some very interesting developments after that. The Ismailis, on the other hand, held that he disappeared with the 7th, and they were at first very important because Ismailis formed a very powerful political movement in the 10th century, started in North Africa, conquered Egypt, established the Fatimid Caliphate, which was very prolific in terms of its thinking and encouragement of learning. And I think they often call the 10th century the Shiite century, because at the same time a Shiite dynasty conquered much of the Middle East, including Baghdad. The Sunni caliph entered into an agreement and remained as caliph of the Sunnis, but the effective ruler was a Shiite Buid from northern Iran. And they too encouraged learning, and it was really under them that Greek philosophy, most of all, flourished. And still today, I think you'll find there's more philosophy in Iran than in many other Muslim majority countries, or at least traditionally orientated Muslim majority countries. Of course, the belief was, both for the Ismailis and the Twelvers, or the majority, the Imamis as they were called, the majority of Shiites, the belief was that the disappeared Mahdi was still there, and that one day he would return to fill the earth with justice. And this is still, as I understand it, the belief, and it played a role in, I think, the Iranian Revolution. Not that Khomeini dared to claim he was such a person, but I think he maybe hinted that he was closely a harbinger or something like that. But anyway, there is that belief. It's extremely analogous, I think, to the Christian belief in the second coming of Christ, though of course the Imam is not supposed to be in any sense God. They did, however, the Shiites held an extremely elevated view of the Caliph as being much more significant theologically and cosmologically than according to the Sunnis. If I may quote a summary of this view in the words of a modern scholar: "Since man is fallible and consequently in need of guidance, divine grace cannot but grant mankind the benefit of rightful guidance at all times by an imam who is immune from sin and error. Since the ruling caliphs are notoriously sinful and fallible and act tyrannically, there must be a hidden imam. Without the latter's existence, mankind would be forsaken by God. Man would indubitably go astray." That's pretty strong language, isn't it, for a ruler, albeit a hidden ruler. Now, the hidden imam's role now, that is to say after the 10th century, is not political power, but religious guidance. He is the true spiritual ruler, and his rulings are known through his associates. Consequently, the scholars, the ulama, and especially the expert jurists, the fuqaha, are for the present spiritual guides. Thus, the Shiite ulama were not only moral and legal experts, as they were for other Muslims, but representatives of the hidden imam. As somebody said, the true leaders have cast the mantle of judgment on the expert jurists. They then had an authority significantly greater than the Sunni ulama, which is, I suppose, clear in Iran now. Anyway, all this gave rise to a remarkable attitude towards politics on the part of the Shia. The present authorities are usurpers. It's because of them that the true leader's gone into hiding. But this led to a remarkable dissociation from the state, withdrawal into communal life, that they no longer aspired to political power. They thought the right thing to do was just to carry on obeying the law, being pious, being religious in their own communities. The realities of power, of which the Shia had much experience, made suspension of political activity the best option. Under an unjust, i.e. non-Shiite ruler, all engagement in public life is in principle forbidden. Their whole attitude was determined by the conviction, born of many bloody and unsuccessful attempts at revolution, that one must await upon divine providence. This meant non-participation and resignation. Until the return of the 12th Imam, one must endure the tyranny and injustice of existing governments. If one's life, family, or property are in danger, one is permitted even to conceal one's true beliefs, what they call taqiyya, precautionary dissimulation. And at the same time, in the Sunni community, because of some of the same factors, there had become a widespread disengagement from politics. But I'll leave that till the next talk when we come to look at the early jurists. So that will lead us on to the development of mainstream Sunni Islam. It's useful to define three genres of Islamic political thought. That is pre-modern Islamic political thought. The first would be jurisprudence, which we look at now. The second would be philosophy, which we'll look at after that. And the third would be the one that deals with the realities of power. They were called the Advice to Kings, Nahisat al-Mulk, which were very prominent from the 8th century, really I would say almost until the 19th century. I guess completely disappeared now. But these were handbooks really for a limited circulation in the court or amongst diplomats as to how you rule, what the duties of a ruler are, a great deal of moral stuff about what justice and how they should behave, but also a great deal of stuff about the methods that can be used in the exercise of power. Now, law and its sources constituted an alternative method of organizing Islamic political thought to patrimonial monarchy. The process by which the Sharia came into being was informal rather than institutional. In its formative period, that is in the first couple of centuries, it depended on oral transmission. It developed rather like a language by accretion from different sources spread by word of mouth, especially the hadith. These collections of hadith gave authoritative solutions to contemporary questions, showing, as one scholar has put it, that everything a Muslim was required to believe or do was founded on traditions purporting to prove that Muhammad, by example or precept, had so ruled. Such hadith played a crucial role in the development of the Sharia and of the Sunnah. The Sunnah, of course, as I'm sure you know, means literally a beaten path, a path beaten down, a precedent, a way of life. And this meant a completely different approach to politics was evolving among the Muslim community. Now, this was the work of scholar teachers, the ulama. These were the religious leaders. Their primary function was the transmission and application of the revealed code of law. There was no formal organization, as there was, for example, among the Christian clergy. They owed their position to mutual recognition by each other. A new type of religious leadership was emerging, based on expertise in memorizing and expounding the hadith, at first circulated by word of mouth, and so perhaps widely accessible, then written down, collected, and interpreted. This diffused method of knowing, democratic in a way, also gave rise to a kind of meritocracy, those possessing the knowledge, ilm, required to understand and apply the religion thus defined. Now, this undermined the project of monarchical authority. Under the Abbasids, the proto-Sunnis eventually won the battle for hearts and minds in Baghdad and other major cities. The political mobilization of the Sunni people, ordinary people, especially the urban masses, went on since at least the early 9th century. In Iraq, especially Baghdad, a spontaneous mass movement which has been described as well organized and strongly motivated, partly inspired by the learned and courageous Ibn Hanbal, began taking what has been called vigilante action to enforce morality, suppress alcohol and prostitution, and attack rival sects. The development of the Hanbali school of thought marked a new stage in the differentiation between religious and political institutions. The social and intellectual orientation of Hanbalism differed sharply from that of the Shia and of the philosophers. Unlike the Shia, it was explicitly anti-elitist, indeed populist, one might say. Unlike the philosophers, the new Sunnism as a whole was well designed to survive the political confusion of the declining power of the Caliphate after about 850 and the political ascendancy of Shiism in the 10th to 11th centuries. By the mid-9th century, they had persuaded the Caliph themselves to adopt their cause, and so the Abbasid dynasty, on losing actual power, became a symbol of religious unity, a champion of perceived orthodoxy. What alternative political ideology, then, did these learned people, the ulama, have to offer? The primary factor was the method by which the right way, i.e. Sharia, literally the way to the watering place, was being moulded. The methodology of law was as important for the history of mental life and political thought as its content. Jurisprudence developed its own discourse, a technical vocabulary, and procedures for correct interpretation. Eventually, of course, there were 4 law schools. I take as an example of this al-Shafi'i. He sought to pluck the true way out of the Quran and Hadith without reference to any external reasoning. On the other hand, he gave authentic Hadith the same juridical standing as the Quran itself. Whatever Muhammad had communicated in the Quran or Hadith was of equal authority, he said. And since the Prophet's opinions had developed over his own lifetime, later pronouncements overrode earlier ones. Thus, Hadith could on occasion modify the Quran. Now, what this approach did was to ring-fence the literal meaning of sacred texts. The textual revelation was self-validating, coherent in its own terms, once properly interpreted. No external mental procedure could validate or invalidate it. One implication was that gaps in the provisions of the law could only be filled by new texts, an invitation, one would imagine, to the invention of hadith or the unconscious acceptance of invented ones. What Muhammad was deemed likely to have said or done was derived from, to quote one historian, the figure of Muhammad as this had been built up in pious circles. The jurists established the terms in which transactions between persons were conducted and disputes settled. This, in the long run, would affect the way people thought about many things. Precise norms for moral, legal, ritual conduct, from contracts to the method of praying, with various penalties for different categories of person, free, slave, unmarried, had been revealed by the deity. In this way, tradition and law became fixed at a time of social flux, but in forms which made it virtually impossible to change them ever after. Once a legal solution had been achieved by this consensus, it could not be undone. For Muhammad had said, "My community will never agree on an error." The only justification for change would be the discovery of new hadith deriving from personal contact with the Prophet. But, given the origin of all hadith in oral tradition, how could you show that new ones existed if they had not been previously known? Even today, the scope for reinterpretation can be limited and the legitimacy of undertaking it contested. Now, this was in fact a major issue, as I'm sure you know, in late 19th, early 20th century reformers like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who all began to say the consensus is not fixed. They thought it was fixed, but in fact it wasn't fixed for all time. We can go back and reinterpret the sources in the light of present circumstances, in the light of more knowledge, etc., etc. I mean, the classic example would be the status of women, of course. it very, very quickly began to be said by a lot of people that the status assigned to them in the consensus was not valid for all times and places, and greater equality could and should be introduced, and so on and so forth. There is hardly any explicit political theory in the Hadith or early jurists. They eventually accepted the caliph's right to designate his own successor as a form, supposedly, of choice by the community, provided there was a formal offer of allegiance, the bay'ah. Hadith exhort one to patience under unjust rule, as we've seen. This may have reflected the stand of the proto-Sunni opposition under the Umayyads. They also, as we've seen, said it is praiseworthy to say just things before unjust governors. Ibn Hanbal taught that even a usurper could be a legitimate caliph, and that an unjust or impious leader must be obeyed and served unless he commits apostasy or fails to provide for communal prayer. He said nothing about how such a bad leader should be dealt with. This may suggest a certain lack of attention or indifference to what we see as constitutional procedures. Several hadith warned, indeed, against having any dealings with political power, the word for which was sultan. One hadith, ascribed to the Caliph al-Rashid, defined the happy man as he who has a fine house, wealth, a beautiful wife, and, quote, does not know me and I do not know him. In other words, happiness means the Caliph doesn't notice you. Others highlighted the moral and spiritual dangers of accepting public office. For example, of 3 qadis, 2 are in hell. Nevertheless, the mindset of the hadith collectors and ulama, justified by the methodology of the jurists, like al-Shafi'i, laid the basis for how political questions would be discussed and determined, what criteria would count in political argument in Sunni Islam. What emerged was not principled or heartfelt support for the caliphate, nor again principled resistance, but a certain critical distancing and mute toleration, based on an understanding among religious groups that nothing better was to be looked for. The ulama wanted a caliph to be there, provided he left them alone. It was a strange combination of obedience, indifference, and resentment. This attitude was carried over to later regimes. Thus, what I would call the literalist narrative method of the hadith collectors and jurists did, after all, give rise to a certain approach to politics: non-resistance, disengagement, what Cronin Cook called the characteristic rabbinic disjunction of piety and power. So after all, what they're saying is that the Muslims had ended up in the same position as the Jews under the Roman Empire, whom they didn't think had done particularly well, of seeing power and piety as 2 separate compartments. Of course, that didn't go on forever. And one reason for this was that the ulama were creating their own non-state structures. So we may ask, had the original political project of Islam faded away? Those who molded the Islamic religion opted for a community, the Ummah, based on a common law and ritual, not on political institutions. And they were in fact successful in perpetuating their social and religious identity despite political instability, despite changes of dynasty and invasions over the generations and down to today. One school of theologians known as Asherism supported this literalist approach, this exclusively based on revelation approach. They held also that everything is caused directly by the all-powerful will of the deity. That is to say that you don't need science or philosophy. human actions, what we do, is directly caused by God, although God, of course, is not responsible for evil. Intellectual coherence, if this approach is taken a certain way, is not even expected. A catchphrase was, "Ask not how, bila kaifa." This approach ousted philosophy and the whole trend towards rational discourse in theology. It was the final assertion of the concrete, particularist, linguistic method of knowledge. In general, this Shafi'ite approach to moral thought meant that right and wrong are prescribed by God through the sacred texts, and that the resulting moral code, the Sharia, is not open to rational debate. It is, through the nature of its origins, i.e. revealed by God, superior to any other moral code, and it can only be known to Muslims. Therefore, to be moral, one has to be a Muslim. Non-Muslims are less moral. There is no rational or naturally knowable moral law known to humans as humans by their own understanding. It was, if you like, a command theory of value. And it had a catastrophic effect on attitudes towards non-believers, especially non-theists. So it was now, i.e. 10th, 11th, 9th, 10th century, that the doctrine of non-resistance finally took root in Sunni Islam. Ibn Hanbal himself, true to his minimalist view of both politics and rationality, affirmed the duty of absolute obedience, as we've seen. The theologian al-Ash'ari himself denounced, quote, "those who hold it right to rise against the imams whenever they appear to fall away from right. We are against armed rebellion and civil war," unquote. Partly because political disruption disrupts the unity of the Ummah. One must never resist a ruler unless he commands disobedience to God, meaning by this a blatant infringement of the Sharia. Any ruler in his right mind could avoid that. Two further stages appear in the development of this approach, and these I think are very important, and here we come to individual political thinkers. In the 11th century, al-Mawardi sought to reassert the primary role of the caliphate by applying categories derived from the now established legal orthodoxy to the political system. So he does go back to unifying religion and politics. The disjunction didn't last. He applied the jurist's method to resolve problems in the political or constitutional structure of Islam. He insisted that the Muslim religious polity both has, and in principle must have, a superior form of political organization to any other, the imamate or caliphate, but this cannot be known by reason alone, but only from revelation, that is, from the sacred texts as interpreted by the orthodox jurists. Al-Mawardi's purpose was not to make a distinction between worldly and divinely revealed power, but rather to reclaim the social and political authority of the caliph. The caliphate is re-established as the instrument for the management of the Islamic people and the fulcrum, to use Western language, of the political as well as the religious dispensation of society. For this, al-Mawardi saw the caliphate as the keystone of a system. He showed how the religious code could be interpreted and developed so as to take into account and explain existing relationships of power. His theory made all Muslim rulers dependent upon the caliph's approval for their authority. He thus laid an intellectual foundation for a revival of the Abbasid Caliphate, which might conceivably have succeeded but for the Mongols. Al-Mawadi does not give the caliph the choice of refusing to recognize any ruler so long as that ruler is fulfilling his duties under Islamic law. It is not said who decides whether such a ruler is failing, and that there is no indication that the caliph has the power to decide, which is strange. Al-Mawadi uses the Quranic term Amir, meaning a military commander, to refer to rulers other than the caliph. This, he argues, is a form of the wazirate, that is the viziership. That is to say, within an Islamic system, the de facto independent ruler, like say the Seljuks, is in principle part of the caliphate, although he appears independent. Their territories are in principle no less under the caliph's authority than those over which he had actual control and ruled through his viziers or chief ministers. While the term Amir originally referred to a military office, Al-Mawadi included judicial, financial, and religious functions. That is, on the understanding that such a person is indeed the caliph's recognized subordinate, the holder of the freely conferred amirate exercises in his own territory not only ordinary political military powers, but also the specific functions of Islamic authority, namely the appointment of religious judges, exacting the legal penalties, leading prayers, conducting jihad. He goes on to distinguish two types of amir, depending on how they got into power. First, the imara freely conferred by the caliph. Second, the imara by conquest. Sunni rulers who recognized and were recognized by the Abbasid caliphs, such as the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, and the Seljuks, were presumably in the first category. The second, by conquest, is subdivided in two. One, if a ruler who has achieved power by conquest recognizes the caliph, offers obedience, recognizes existing religious officials, raises taxes in accordance with the Sharia, implements legal penalties, and generally upholds the Sharia and encourages others to do so, then the deputy must recognize and invest him. And therefore he has presumably the same authority as one whose imara was freely conferred by the caliph. Most contemporary Sunni rulers would, it seems, fit into this category. But if such conditions are not met, the caliph may still recognize the amir, but he must depute someone else to ensure that the necessary religious functions are in fact fulfilled. As one scholar has summed this up, although contrary to the principles of Shari government, this is Al-Mawadi. Although contrary to the principles of Shari government, this is permissible, i.e. the recognition of a apparently illegitimate ruler, for two reasons. One, necessity dispenses with conditions which are impossible to fulfill, and two, fear of injury to public interest justifies a relaxation of conditions which would not be justified in private matters. Now that, I think, is very interesting, because here Al-Mawadi was applying two recognized principles of the Sharia, that one can dispense with certain rules under necessity, and that the public interest overrides most other considerations. So that was Al-Mawadi. Now, jumping forward 2 centuries, I want to introduce Ibn Taymiyya. He undertook a further development of this juristic approach to politics and to constitutional matters before and after the year 1300. Now, things were very different, of course, by now. The Mongols had invaded, they had destroyed the Baghdad Abbasid Caliphate, and they had conquered a large part of the previously Muslim-controlled world, though most of them rapidly became converted to Islam. They were finally defeated only in 1260, what I think is one of the most important battles in world history, of Ain Jalut, in what is now Syria, defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt, and thereby the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. They made no further incursions into the Muslim-controlled world, and their potential for invading Europe was significantly dented. Now, Ibn Taymiyya wrote a book called The Book on the Government of the Religious Law. Here he argued that the Sharia, to be true to its all-embracing mission, has to be updated. He sought to achieve this. He sought to achieve the moral purity of Hanbali tradition, not, like his predecessors, by grudging abstention from high politics, but by applying the Sharia to high politics and matters of government. Instead of taking the road of the monarchists and saying you have to accept the realities of power, he said the realities of power have to be adjusted to accord with the Sharia. This, he insisted, was the original project of Islam. It had first been achieved by the righteous caliphs. Now it required other instruments. The goal was what Ibn Taymiyya called al-siyasa al-sharia, which we may translate, I suppose, as righteous rule. That is to say, government carried out on the basis of the Sharia. Previously, Muslims writing about the realities of power and the methods by which government should be conducted had mostly worked in the advice to kings genre, with large imports from the Sasanian tradition and an often blatant advocacy of realpolitik, occasionally reminiscent of Machiavelli in the later West. They were as much concerned with promoting the power of the ruler as they were with promoting Islam. Ibn Taymiyya's treatise began by insisting that God has joined, quote, knowledge and the pen, with their task of preaching and persuasion, to power and the sword, with their task of victory and domination. His treatise concluded by proclaiming the superiority of Islam over the other two revealed faiths, on the ground that they proclaim religion without striving to achieve what Ibn Taymiyya calls the conditions necessary for its existence, namely power, holy war, material resources. In other words, Judaism and Christianity tended to divide the spiritual from the political. Islam didn't. The trouble with the world today, he said, is that Muslim rulers too think that they can achieve material ends by means of force, ambition, self-interest. Religious people, on the other hand, think they can achieve spiritual ends by mere piety. Quote, thus they abstain from all participation in political life and forbid it to others. The right course is a happy mean, concern for material and moral interests of the community, which are closely linked. Honesty joined with power. And his main point, I suppose, is that religion needs the power of the state. He was particularly insistent that religion cannot be practiced without state power. The religious duty of commanding the good and forbidding the evil simply cannot be achieved, quote, except through the power and authority of an imam. And, quote, all other duties which God has decreed, namely holy war, justice, pilgrimage, communal prayer, assisting the oppressed, legal penalties, and so on, cannot be fulfilled except through the power and authority of a ruler. And as he said in another quote, which I rather like, religion without power, that is without sultan, without power, holy war and wealth is as bad as sultan, wealth and conflict without religion. And all this puts me in mind of Maududi in the 20th century. Ibn Taymiyya proved this in Islamic terms by insisting that what we call political offices and activities in fact fall into the categories defined in the Sharia as trusts and public functions, wilayat. Thus the obligation, quote, to deliver trusts back to their owners and to judge with justice, that is, to enforce legal penalties against the highborn as well as the poor, falls fairly and squarely upon the political leaders. The Sharia principles of economic justice in exchange, restitution, and distribution to the needy must be observed by public authorities as well as by private individuals. Incidentally, Ibn Taymiyya sought to protect the rights of private ownership. The purpose of all public functions is the material and spiritual welfare of human beings. But this depends upon the postulate of commanding the good and forbidding the bad, which is the function, the supreme goal of every public function. No government can achieve this without adhering to Islamic norms. On the other hand, commanding the good and forbidding the bad cannot be effective without the threat of coercion. So, here Ibn Taymiyya achieved an indissoluble link between religion and the state. As he says, it is therefore a duty to consider the amirate as a form of religion, as one of the acts by which one approaches God. The ruler's exercise of power is, quote, one of the most important duties of religion. Quote again, since the aim assigned to dawla, the state, and shauka, force, is to approach God and to put his religion into practice, therefore, when state and religion are wholly employed for this purpose, perfect spiritual and temporal prosperity is ensured. Incidentally, Ibn Taymiyya was one of the very few people who had enormous courage in these days, and he was in fact spent a lot of his time in prison under the Mamluks for criticizing, for trying to make them behave better. Well, you will be surprised that I think this may be seen as going back to the original position of Islam, to what differentiated it most from Christianity. That is, that humans' material and spiritual welfare are inseparable. The theory of state origins corroborates this, of the origin of the state, that is. If humans need association, and so are political by nature, and if their common purposes require obedience to one who commands them, then religion needs the state. Religion and government need one another. This way of looking at things, I think, was further explored empirically very soon after by Ibn Khaldun, whose study of history explored in detail the relationships between religion and other social forces. One can thus say that rulership and the Sharia are folded into one another as righteous government. The leadership is a special function requiring force, kingship, and sultan, power. The state is fully incorporated into religious thought. At the same time, the distinction between caliph and sultan disappears for practical purposes. This was extremely convenient because there was no caliph at this time. And so what Ibn Taymiyya is doing here, or makes it possible to do, is to adopt the position of the sultan is the caliph. The two are equated. Maybe not always in the way he meant, but this was the common practice thereafter, that the sultan, i.e. the ruler, carries out the functions, i.e. the supervision of religion, formally ascribed to the caliph. And we find the Ottomans eventually explicitly claimed to be caliphs themselves. This brought further obligations. No ruler can dispense with, can, quote, dispense themselves from the vicegerency of the Prophet, i.e. from the duties of being a caliph. Within the Islamic community, and this is quite important, whom incidentally are called by this time the people of tradition and community, al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, Ibn Taymiyya accepted the plurality of separate states, i.e. political reality. Within each state, the leader, the imam or ruler, is responsible for the application of the legal punishments, the observation of fast and pilgrimage, the performance of public services, the application of social and economic norms, and above all, the conduct of prayer and of holy war, i.e. Caliph and Sultan are now one and the same person. There is no mitigation of the strict Hanbali principle that all public authorities must be obeyed so long as their commands do not contradict the Sharia. On the other hand, the ruler is morally, legally obliged to consult others, and all Muslims have the religious and legal duty to give good counsel, commanding the good, forbidding the evil. This view of righteous government meant that all practical aspects of government fell within the moral universe of religion. So I think Ibn Taymiyya brings out with amazing clarity certain ideas which may plausibly be regarded as intrinsic to Islamic political thought. However, he was here perhaps the last original thinker in Sunni fiqh. For a long time, he had few followers and little influence. Then, in the 18th century, he was adopted by a movement in the Arabian Peninsula known as Wahhabism. From then on, his ideas have exercised increasing influence on Sunni political thought. Right, well, now I'm going to try and say something about the Muslim philosophers of the period from around 750 to around 1200. The revolution of Muhammad could be interpreted in different ways. The way which came to dominate, as we've seen, was that of jurisprudence. This emphasized conduct above everything. But this was not the only possibility on offer. Things could, I would contend, have been somewhat different. One alternative possibility is in the writings of the Muslim philosophers. These stemmed from the translations of Plato and Aristotle into Arabic, which began in the 8th century. The decline of the caliphate coincided with the golden age of Islamic humanism and philosophy. Cultural and intellectual life benefited from the political and religious diversity of the House of Islam, just as it did later in Europe. Rulers became patrons of the arts and sciences. The fusion of Arabic, Iranian, and Greek ideas produced an outburst of cultural vitality. Several philosophers came from Central Asia. Many gravitated to Baghdad, where the minority Shiite dynasty, with its taste for toleration and pluralism, encouraged both Shiite and other theologians and philosophers, and founded a great medical center. The Ismaili Fatimids in Egypt founded the Al-Azhar Mosque Library Study Center, and also what they call a House of Wisdom, I think Bait al-Hikmah, which meant a library including the works of philosophers. In Greco-Arabic philosophy, the ruler was presented as a philosopher king or the perfect individual. A new approach to politics and government was developed between the age of Al-Ma'mun, that's around 800, and the Seljuks. But philosophy in Islam is not quite like philosophy in modern Europe or ancient Greece. It never questioned the tenets of Islam. It did not, as in the early Greek and modern European worlds, submit nature, ethics, existence itself to critical examination. Or as one scholar put it, the space which philosophy sought to occupy was already filled by theology, the theory of language, and the well-developed jurisprudence. Plato and Aristotle were used as guides to understand the world and humanity within the framework of ethical monotheism, which had already been developed in Alexandria before, before the rise of Islam. Plato and Aristotle were seen as corroborating and by independent means the worldview of Islam. Sorry. Muslim philosophers thought it was their task to restate and interpret the Platonic Aristotelian body of knowledge and transmit it to the Islamic world for future generations. What was needed was to fill out certain points, especially where the coming of Islam had fundamentally changed human society. This was how Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina saw their contribution to political theory. The philosophers' view of the relationship between reason and revelation was fundamental to their view of political knowledge and the enterprise of government. The project of Al-Farabi and most, I'll call them philosophers, meaning by that Muslim philosophers, was to unite two spheres of discourse, the Judeo-Islamic and the Platonic Hellenic. They did not question that God, the Ummah, and the Imam were the bedrock of cosmic and human existence. Neoplatonism stated how God, humanity, the spiritual and material cosmos were related to each other and acted upon each other. Al-Farabi, the Brethren of Purity, who I'll come to in a minute, Ibn Sina and others saw this as a means of understanding and interpreting the Prophet's message. In politics, philosophy was above all an attempt to illuminate the Islamic law, the imamate, and the community through this Platonic language. Philosophers claimed that they could attain by demonstrative proofs knowledge of the same truths which the prophets taught by inspiration and rhetoric. This, I think, is crucial, that they took revelation as given, and where they claimed to be different from, say, the jurists, was that they claimed they could prove the teachings of the Quran by reason, and that this was, they went on to argue, a superior means of knowing. They claimed, of course, that the Prophet had done this as well, but the Prophet had combined reason with rhetoric, and rhetoric was necessary in order for most people to understand these rational truths. Philosophy, as one of them put it, is true education. Truth is the fundamental category, and it can be reached by different routes. This held out the prospect of an alternative theory of knowledge, an alternative, I would say, pattern of social authority to that of the jurists. Rational discourse, according to Al-Farabi and most philosophers, was an alternative way of perceiving, explaining, and above all, proving the truths of the Quran. But for Farabi, philosophy was not merely an alternative, but, as I said, a superior way of knowing the divine truths. Religion, he says, is an imitation of philosophy. In everything of which philosophy gives an account based on intellectual perception, religion gives an account based on imagination. Philosophy demonstrates what religion symbolizes. This reminds me of Hegel in the West later. Prophecy and religion remain essential, but only because so few can travel the path of philosophy. They seem to have regarded philosophy as an alternative articulation of Islamic beliefs, more promising than what they saw as the crass popular narrativism of the hadith collectors and indeed the jurists. Could this not make possible a more rationalist approach, reducing religious jurisprudence to just one possible articulation of the Quranic message? Greco-Arabic philosophy did not produce fundamentally new ideas. In its basic structure and reach, the philosopher's vision remained bounded by their Islamic beliefs. For example, the cosmopolitan notion of humanity, which had been prevalent in late antiquity, was not taken up. The Islamic philosophers did not take up the idea of a universal intercultural moral language for all humans, or of rights and duties pertaining to humans as such. They did, however, for the most part insist that right and wrong, as embodied in the Sharia, are subject to rational understanding and rational choice. They upheld the freedom of the will against the developing consensus that everything was predetermined. We can prove the validity of the Sharia, i.e. no right and wrong, from human experience and from a rational appraisal of the consequences of our actions. The philosopher rejected the view that there is no perceptible rationality behind prophetic morality, that we only know right and wrong because it's been revealed. And they also held a fascinating notion, which they get straight out of Aristotle and Plato, that true happiness and self-fulfillment come through rational understanding. One achieves supreme happiness through the development of the rational faculty, leading to full inner perception of the truth. You find this also again in Ibn Khaldun. Sorry, I've lost my way now. Philosophy could, on this basis, have been perceived as a road to the truth which non-Muslims also could travel. But only a small minority took that view. And these were a remarkable group called the Brethren of Purity, who were an Ismaili Shiite group, secret because persecuted, based in Basra, who produced an amazing encyclopedia of 57 volumes. And they said, for example, they put Socrates and Plato in the line of the prophets. They had a theory of the cyclical human history, and that the various ages, various prophets dominated, and their teachings were all of continuing worth, though that of Muhammad was superior, but the others were also of continuing worth. Sorry, I'm going to lose my way now. Al-Farabi followed Aristotle. We now turn to political theory. Followed Aristotle in asserting that political understanding, or science, is the master science of human conduct. This is really just restating what the Quran says in Aristotelian terms, I think. Political science enables people to attain virtue and happiness, virtues and vices. politics has a moral aspect and is a form of philosophy in the sense that it seeks knowledge of universals. It also has a practical aspect based on observation and experience. This is, quote, the faculty that man acquires, this is political understanding, through long experience in political deeds, dealing with morals and the individuals existing in actual states, and becoming practically wise through experience and long observation, as in the case of medicine. Now, Al-Farabi based the imama, leadership, political authority, on knowledge. That is what gives a person true authority. Knowledge derives from certain demonstration, and it is the superior science, the one with the most perfect claim to authority. The one who receives revelation is the true prince. The philosophers understood the state as being composed of occupational groups. They made a great deal of the makeup, or Al-Farabi did, the makeup of the state, that human beings, first of all, tend to engage in different professions in their commerce with one another, and these professions are separate occupational groups within society, but they need the political ruler to keep them at peace and to orchestrate them. But they also saw the origins of the state in an interesting way as being based upon humans' proclivity for greed, lust, conflict and competition. These things demonstrate the need for law and government. So their view of the need for government was somewhat like the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who in his famous statement said that without the state, which he called the Leviathan, human life would be poor, nasty, brutish, solitary, and short. I think he's quite right. So it didn't so much depend upon consent. That's interesting. It was necessity which brought the state into existence. The main purpose of the state is the attainment by all the people of knowledge and virtue. Also the purpose, obviously, of religion. It's also Plato. Plato makes this very clear. So does Aristotle. It's a completely unmodern idea, if you like. You won't find this in Western political thought today. In that sense, the Muslim and indeed Christian medieval philosophers were much closer to Plato and Aristotle than modern Western thought is on the whole. Though I would assert they need to go back to this, actually. The ultimate purpose of political activity is not just wealth and security. I mean, it has very difficult implications, this, because but that the state should also be geared towards the attainment of knowledge, virtue, and happiness. Now, I don't know if you've, in recent social discussion, the concept of happiness has come back. A guy called Richard Layard, an economist at the LSE, I think, has written this wonderful book in which, and this is absolutely true, what happens in modern society? Half the population is depressed. What does that mean? Very expensive, lots of drugs, I mean medical drugs as well as any other kind, lots of days off work, very expensive. Why not make people happy? How do you do that? Counselling. Well, that's, I agree with him, that's his route. But the point is that happiness is not divorced from politics. So here you have the link with the philosopher's view, which is that the purpose of the state is to, of course, we would not now say it is to make people happy in a particular way, but it is to make it possible. So, I mean, I would say the whole educational system should be geared in this way to teach people the possibilities of virtue and happiness. And the great 18th century European despot, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was a great lover of the Enlightenment and talked with Voltaire, said at one point, in this country, all religions must be tolerated, because everyone must be happy in their own way. So there you have the combination of happiness with pluralism, I think. Now, the ruler must educate people according to their different capacities, and this is another, to us, very strange belief of the medieval Muslim philosophers, and I'm sure you'll find it in probably every culture, more or less, certainly in Plato. People can know the truth either by demonstrative argument or rhetorical persuasion or narrative similitude, as they call it. In other words, storytelling and rhetoric and preaching and etc. The legislator must therefore use all of these means to promote happiness. Now, Ibn Sina, the other function which they give the ruler is legislation. They speak of the legislator, philosopher, ruler. And Ibn Sina, who incidentally was born in Bukhara, in what is now Uzbekistan, 980, died in Isfahan, is what is now Iran, 1037, was a genius whose work during his short and hectic life, he is alleged to have written most of his books while on camelback. He acted as an advisor to the prince. Work was to influence philosophy and medicine until the 17th century, and philosophy in Iran until this day. Ibn Sina based his theory of the state on the empirical generalization that it is in the nature of human beings to complement one another. This corrects what I just said about competition, of course. It is necessary, quote, for a man to find his sufficiency in another of his species, who in his turn finds in the former his sufficiency. This asserts the division of labor when, quote, one man would provide another with vegetables while the other would bake for him. One man would sew for another while the other would provide him with needles. I think Al-Ghazali later on said that when you eat a loaf of bread, it's the product of 100 different skills, which is probably true. Only collectively are human beings self-sufficient, and therefore they form cities or states and societies. Such partnerships require transactions, agreements. These in return require law and justice. These require a lawgiver, and therefore the state or the legislator is necessary for human survival. But people will only obey laws if the person making them, this is a very interesting point, is made to appear exceptional. Therefore, he says, the prophet must perform miracles, because that's the way his teachings become accepted. And this actually replicates the theory of the modern sociologist Emil Durkheim, who in his reflections on religion and social life said something like, the function of religion is to make moral rules appear non-discussable, so people obey them anyway, because once you start discussing them, you no longer obey them properly. So if they have a religious basis, they're much more authoritative. The content of legislation in Ibn Sina is also very interesting. It includes a great deal of social and economic regulation. They deduced that the government must redistribute wealth from producing groups to non-producing groups. I said they divide society into occupational groups. The producing groups are listed as farmers, artisans, and merchants. The non-producing ones, soldiers, civil servants, the poor and disabled. This sort of distinction runs right through medieval Islamic political thought, completely disappeared from modern. But this idea of different classes, you wouldn't call them classes, orders in society. They're usually called pillars, in the implication being they're equal. They're usually said to be 4 pillars, and this comes from the Indo-Iranian view of castes, but they're no longer castes, though they might in practice be hereditary. And these are usually said to be the men of knowledge, warriors, merchants, and producers, artisans. Interestingly, in this society, and this is true above all in the Ottomans, the upper classes are the ones who receive taxes. namely the men of learning and the soldiers. The lower classes pay taxes. They're the farmers, artisans, and merchants. So it's kind of the opposite way around to what we have today. Ibn Sina also said the ruler must get rid of idleness and unemployment. Also, occupations whereby properties and utilities are transferred without any benefit rendered in exchange, such as gambling and usury, must be banned. Government must supervise weights and measures and commerce, as with the market regulator in Islamic public law. And he even said, and this is not particularly Muslim, I don't think, like Plato, but following Plato, that marriage and childbirth, child rearing, should be regulated. And then he says divorce should be permitted, but only by the man. I suppose that is in accordance with the Sharia at the time. Rules of the Sharia were thus justified partly on the grounds of rationality and social discipline. But I think what this shows is that there was a great deal of flexibility possible if you took the philosophical approach. That's all I would say. So while Ibn Sina retained most of the substance of the Sharia, he placed it in a quite new epistemological context, and its functions are made explicitly to include the functions of ordinary civil law. His is a relatively open system, subject to adaptation, as one would expect, since it is based on the rational understanding of the human predicament. Now, in conclusion on this part of the philosophers, though I have one or two more to come, the main period of the philosophers, that is from mid-8th to mid-11th century. As I've said, they insisted that the philosophical path is open only to an intellectual elite. So there's a critical consequence for this, a sharp distinction between those, in their view, between those capable of philosophy and those needing religion. This is exactly parallel to Plato, who said that a few could follow the path of reason, but this required outstanding gifts and a very long education. And most people, in Plato's view, had to rely on what he called the myth of the noble lie, which was that they were by nature inferior, therefore they had to obey. Well, obviously that's not what they say. They say they need persuasion by other means of rhetoric and storytelling, as most people. This somewhat paralleled Shiite views of spiritual enlightenment. Al-Farabi and the brethren, incidentally, based the distinction between what they called the elite and the masses on the view that individuals have fundamentally different mental capacities. Now, the philosophers' time was relatively short. They rapidly lost their audience. Partly we can see why, but also because they were frowned upon by the juristic consensus as being insufficiently orthodox. One could say that they challenged the ulama's social status, because if the people do not depend upon those with what's called religious knowledge for settlement of disputes, then they will have less authority. Anyway, the philosophers had a rather pessimistic view of their own prospects. Farabi described their position in deviant societies, which meant the societies of his own time, as that of strangers or weeds, aliens, in fact, resident aliens. They had a sense of isolation, and they were, in fact, often subject to individual harassment. Farabi himself moved from Baghdad into Syria, actually found with a Shiite dynasty in Syria for a while. I would say that the philosophers were the most articulate and original political thinkers of this period. other Islamic thinkers took up at least their theory of the origin and purpose of political authority. They had opened up a vision of Islam without jurisprudence, almost one might say of the Quran without the Hadith. One of them, Al-Amiri, remarked of the orthodox jurists, quote, "They have now made it their purpose to lord it over the common people, to curry favour with the authorities, to gain control over the property of the powerless." Well, I now move to a slightly later phase in the development of Islamic philosophy, when it is no longer widely current, but a few relatively isolated thinkers. And I start this by looking at Al-Ghazali in the late 11th century, who is certainly a philosopher, but he's an anti-philosophical philosopher. He argued that reason cannot be sufficient because it cannot establish its own premises. You always have to reason from some premises which are given you from elsewhere. And therefore, it is inferior to what he called intuitive knowledge. He wrote a famous book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which argues precisely that. On the other hand, Al-Ghazali, who incidentally had been given the task by the caliph of the time of re-establishing Sunni Islam in an intellectually credible way against what they saw, rightly I think, as the threat of Shiism, which was very, very intellectually powerful at this time, the 11th century. He was given the task, and he wrote the famous book, his great book called The Revival of the Religious Sciences, which covers everything. However, he underwent some sort of spiritual crisis, left Baghdad and went nobody knows where for a long time, and when he re-emerged, it was with the conviction that Sunni Orthodox jurisprudence and theology in their present form were incapable of inspiring true religion. Al-Ghazali chose a way that would take him deeper inside himself and also closer to the pious masses in whose name the revival enterprise was undertaken. He turned to personal, intuitive knowledge and the Sufi way. Intuitive, ecstatic knowledge, silent, knowledge which does not know what it knows. Mystical awareness illuminates the soul and unites it with God. Knowing is indeed the supreme religious act, as he says, the basis for happiness in this world and the next. It has priority over worship, prayer, legal observance, good works. Thomas Aquinas would say exactly the same in the 13th century in Catholic Europe, and I'm sure he didn't get it from Ghazali. Independently, he said something like intellectual activity is more important than singing in the church. The knowledge Al-Ghazali had in mind was the direct knowledge acquired by spiritual experience. It is personal experience which conveys absolute certainty. Now, I would suggest that Al-Ghazali's role in the history of both religious and political thought was pivotal. No other individual theorist, I would say, has had such a profound influence because he used philosophy to justify revelationism, i.e., to undermine philosophy. And it was this approach which came to dominate Muslim thinking later. It might have done anyway, but any possible, so to speak, counterattack from the philosophers was possibly disabled from the start by Al-Ghazali's extremely penetrating argument. Well, there was a counterattack, and it came from, I think, one of the greatest of all philosophers, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as he's known in the West, who lived, as you know, in Spain and North Africa in the 12th century. And he is one whose works I have been able to look at a little bit because one of his major works survives only in Latin. His intellectual project was actually focused on Aristotle. he was the first Muslim philosopher to recognize, remarkably, that Plato and Aristotle were quite different. Very strongly disagreed with one another on some points, but this had been obscured by the earlier synthesis. In fact, it was the Almohad ruler in southern Spain who apparently at one time said, "Is there nobody who can illuminate Aristotle for me?" And Ibn Rushd promptly said, "Yes, me," and he wrote a commentary on every single work of Aristotle, the last of all being the Politics, because actually the Politics, Aristotle's Politics didn't exist in the Muslim world, but he wrote a political treatise nonetheless. Aristotle, he thought, was of supreme importance because he relied exclusively on conceptual analysis and syllogistic, i.e. logical, demonstration. Philosophy for him meant the strict interpretation of Aristotle and adherence to his method without the accretions of Neoplatonism. Secondly, Aristotle covered everything that could be known. Now, Ibn Rushd set out to realize his project in two ways. First, he sought, by textual analysis, to purge Aristotle's texts of Neoplatonic material. His achievements in this field are still admired by modern scholars. Secondly, like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, he attempted to complete the Aristotelian work by adding knowledge gained in Islamic times. This especially concerned matters of law and social organization. And incidentally, Ibn Rushd was a leading jurist and wrote a very great book, which very few people have read, I certainly haven't, on exposition of the entire code of religious law. Well, he defended philosophy against Al-Ghazali in a book with, to me, the rather amusing title, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. He affirmed that the discovery of causes is an intrinsic part of knowledge, and that such causal explanation is valid and underpins our knowledge of God himself. He is referring here, I think, to the Aristotelian argument for a prime mover and a first cause, which the Muslim and Christian philosophers equated with God, that everything has a cause, there must be a first cause somewhere, and that proves the necessity of God. Intuition and mysticism alone are not enough, says Ibn Rushd. Ghazali's reliance on personal experience as the starting point for knowledge of God leaves too much to prejudice and passion. Ibn Rushd seems to have pursued an isolated quest, demanding even greater courage than that of European philosophers, because he was more isolated. The place of philosophy in relation to religious knowledge was the crucial problem. On this, he wrote what he called an authoritative treatise and exposition of the convergence which exists between the religious law and philosophy. He saw no tension or contradiction, such as experienced by European intellectuals of this time, between faith and reason. He was no Averroist in the European sense. He solved the problem of faith and reason by drawing a distinction between different methods by which they arrive at the same truths. And here he's like the earlier philosophers, namely demonstration, dialectic, and rhetoric. Knowledge by demonstration is the best. It can only be attained by those of outstanding intellectual and moral ability. Next comes dialectic or rational explanation, which is what theologians do. Lastly comes rhetoric and symbolism, by which most people acquire knowledge, and they must be content with other people's interpretation, and therefore they fall short of perfection. But for Ibn Rushd, all these three methods teach the same truths. Religion and faith teach the same as philosophy. Thus, everyone can follow and be enlightened by the Sharia, albeit in fundamentally different ways. Religion is therefore absolutely necessary and obligatory, precisely because it leads people, quote, towards wisdom in a way universal to all human beings. Ibn Rushd did not criticize jurists, and as I said, he was one himself. It follows from all this that philosophers thought that their superior mode of knowledge was the best qualified to interpret the Quran, the Sunnah, and the religious law. Aristotelian moral philosophy, according to them, can and must be combined with the Sharia, for the law promotes justice and the other virtues defined and explained by Aristotle. Ibn Rushd rejected the view of al-Shafi'i, long prevalent, as we've seen, in jurisprudence and widely established in Islamic discourse as a whole, that right and wrong are not determined by the nature of what they are, but by divine command only, so that they cannot be known by reason, but only through revelation. He followed Aristotle in holding that, as one scholar sums it up, good and evil, beneficial and harmful, beautiful and ugly, are something that exists by nature, not by convention. Well, to bring this to a very sad conclusion, Ibn Rushd's writings were scarcely read in the Arabic-speaking world. The effect of his work was to transmit Aristotelian thought and Islamic philosophy to Christian Western Europe. He had been supported, as I said, by the ruler of Muslim Spain, but military defeats by the Spanish Christians led to a reaction from the ulama and the people, which was to say, we've been defeated because we are too impious, we are not sufficiently religious. And one of the consequences of this was that philosophers must be banned. So Ibn Rushd was forced into exile in Morocco. His works must have been known because his sole successor, as far as I can tell, in the Muslim majority world was Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406, having had a conversation incidentally with Tamburlaine, but not, I think, because of that. But what a successor he was. He was inspired by the writings of Ibn Rushd, which he found in a library in Spain, to undertake his great work, which we know as the Universal History, and above all the Introduction, which expresses a philosophy of history, what we nowadays call a sociology, long, long before sociology became so developed. However, Ibn Khaldun resembled al-Ghazali more than Ibn Rushd in that he ultimately subordinated philosophy to religious orthodoxy. There's an absolutely splendid passage in Ibn Khaldun where he talks about the inadequacies of philosophy, particularly political philosophy. One of his criticisms is that philosophers who talk about politics don't know anything about practice, and the various things. It's well worth reading if you look at, it's called the Muqaddimah, the Introduction to the Universal History. There is this very interesting passage in which he rejects the idea that philosophy can know the truth. And exactly contemporary, the European philosopher William of Ockham, born a few miles from here in Surrey, was saying exactly the same thing. He's called a nominalist. He said, reason cannot tell you the truth. It can only work as a kind of logic. You only know the truth from revelation. But for quite different reasons, he was deemed a heretic and had to go and find refuge in Central Europe somewhere. However, that's quite important, I think. And Ibn Rushd's political works do not survive in Arabic, and Ibn Khaldun was virtually forgotten until the 19th century, when he was discovered by the French in North Africa, his works. So I'm afraid the truth is that Muslim philosophy effectively died out, and what was written thereafter was just imitations and summaries and nothing original, until really in the late 19th century people like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who wanted to change the whole mindset of his fellow Muslims and wanted to re-engage them with politics. They went back to the philosophers and said, here is an example of what we should have been doing, and they wanted to revive philosophy in a Muslim context. So in that way, the writings of the philosophers became, once more, very much a live issue. Well, as Mitan says, I want now next to talk about the early modern empires, and okay, and I'd like to start off with the Mughals, of which I don't have too much to say, and then the Safavids in Iran, and then come to the Ottomans, which will lead on to the issue of westernization in Turkey. So it's slightly different from the thing as advertised. During the period 1500 to 1800, the different ideological routes taken by the Muslim majority world and the Christian Western world became increasingly clear. The bulk of the Islamic world was divided up between three great powers: the Mughals in India, the Safavids in Iran, the Ottomans from east of the Black Sea to the North African coast, from Hungary to the Hijaz. Huge swathe of territory at its height. Under these powers, political, social and intellectual divisions within the Islamic world were greater than before, I think. Though eventually, in the 20th century, when these empires had all disappeared, these differences proved not to be as permanent as one might have thought. For a while, there were almost three separate Islamic thought worlds, I think, especially regarding government and social organization. Each, in the struggle for survival and expansion, developed a praxis somewhat different from what had gone before and strikingly different from each other. The differences between Sunnis and Shiites now became entrenched in rival empires. One may compare the development of so-called Protestant and Catholic states in Europe at this time. The Ottomans were drawn into the Eurocentric world order. Each of the Muslim empires had its particular institutions. The Safavids built a state dedicated to and supported by Twelver Shi'ism. It watched over the rise of the Shiite jurists, mujtahids, to political power. The Mughals presided over a new relationship between Muslims and Hindus. Most of all, the Ottomans created what I think was a wholly new kind of Islamic state, which lasted far longer than any before or since. There were no formal limits on the ruler's power, but it was assumed that his function was to look after his subjects, protect them by arms, and support the economy. The subject's function was to serve and revere him, and the state was equated with the ruling house, hence its name, the Ottomans, as you find, of course, with the Saudi Arabia today. As I say, to start with, I'll take a brief look at the Mughals. And what was distinctive there was an early move towards much greater toleration and much greater equality between Muslims and non-Muslims, initiated by the Emperor Akbar, who had conquered a large part of northern India and central India, and then went on to try and facilitate his rule by giving the Hindus a full share in society and government. He repealed those aspects of the Sharia that discriminated against other religions. Hindus were allowed to repair their temples and to build new ones. Conversion to Islam by force was prohibited. Those previously converted by force were permitted to return to Hinduism without the prescribed death penalty for apostasy. He extended the donation of land for charitable purposes to yogis, Brahmins, and Parsis. Finally, he abolished the discriminatory poll tax, so ending a long-standing religious tradition basic to Muslim privilege, poll tax on non-Muslims. However, the following century saw a fairly rapid re-Islamization of the polity, and eventually Aurangzeb, in the later 17th century, embarked again upon jihad against Hindu rulers and extended the Mughal Empire over southern India, and he reimposed the poll tax on non-Muslims. After him, the Mughal Empire fell apart. Governors such as the Nawab of Bengal gained independence. Sikhs set up their own state. Hindu princes regained power in southern India. Afghan tribes invaded. Delhi was twice looted. The Mughals still claimed that they occupied what they called the throne of Khilafat and sovereignty, and they maintained until the end, 1857, the fiction that other rulers in India, including the British, were their delegates. Now let's turn to the Safavids in Iran. They were started when the Shiite Sufi family of the Safavids invaded and took over the whole of Iran very rapidly in about 1501. The Safavid dynasty reunited Iran for the first time since the Muslim conquests as an independent great power. It established for the first and for a long time the only time a nation state in Islamdom. The Safavid Empire made the revolutionary demand that all Muslims accept one version of Islam, a version hitherto noted mainly for its political quietism under threat of force. Twelver Shi'ism was imposed as the official religion which all subjects of the empire were obliged to profess. Many Sunnis were executed. Rival Sufi orders were attacked. Never before in Islam had such piety gone with such intolerance. But then, during the later 16th and the 17th centuries, two fundamentally different conceptions of religious and political leadership vied for supremacy in Iran. There were two schools of Twelver Shiite thought. One, the Akhbaris, traditionists, who adhered to the tradition of quietism, which went back to the 9th century. The other, who called themselves the principled, the Usuli, developed a new slant. The person primarily responsible for a new theoretical development was al-Karaki, who spanned the later 15th, early 16th century, and lived mainly in Iraq. For centuries, as we saw, Orthodox Twelver Shiites had held congregational prayer and other communal activities to be suspended during the absence of the 12th Imam. Their practice was forbidden. In politics, they were quietist and practiced dissimulation when necessary. Al-Karaki now taught that congregational prayer was legal, indeed obligatory, provided what they called a well-qualified jurist, mujtahid, was present. Finally, while the old Twelver view allowed only the Imam to use coercive force, al-Karaki extended the legitimacy of coercion to the mujtahid as the deputy of the hidden Imam when he was delivering judgment and imposing the legal penalties. Karaki's affirmative, world-embracing teaching ensured the weekly assembly of the male population and gave the jurists a salient role as corporate prayer leaders. In making such radical departures from long-standing Shiite tradition, al-Karaki claimed to be speaking on behalf of the absent Imam himself as his deputy. This was a claim to the highest possible authority, which no Orthodox Twelver teacher had made before. It revolutionized the attitude of those jurists and mullahs who followed this so-called principled school of thought towards public life and government. Whereas traditional Shi'ism discouraged participation or even contact with rulers, al-Karaki and his colleagues eagerly collaborated and claimed doctrinal support for doing so. Quote, "The best of the acts of worship is the ordering of the affairs of the people." the well-qualified jurist was now not merely permitted but required to play a full part in applying the Sharia in the Shah's religious courts. Al-Karaki's most remarkable development in doctrine, and the one with the greatest long-term repercussions, was his elevation of the jurists. The mujtahid, the highly qualified jurist, could, quote, undertake many practical activities previously reserved for the hidden imam. The rank of mujtahid was given only to few, but the ulama generally shared in their enhanced status as persons possessing a degree of knowledge not shared by ordinary people. The new Shiite doctrine encouraged people to see the ulama as lesser links with the hidden leader. The concept of the general competence of the person of the mujtahid allowed the mujtahid not only the traditional right to answer questions of a puzzled believer, but the right to define the scope of his own authority. This theory greatly extended the scope of independent judgment, ijtihad, and therefore potentially of rational judgment in religious and legal matters, even if only for the few. It allowed living specialists to override their deceased predecessors. A living mujtahid is exempt from correction. The masses, or followers, were supposed to exercise submission towards a well-qualified jurist. It was, in effect, a new version of the philosopher king, as I think became clear with Khomeini and the new constitution of the Republic of Iran. Once again, a distinction, this time an intellectual one, between elite and masses was made central to religious thought. As time went on, this principal version challenged the Safavid dynasty's claim to charismatic leadership in religion and politics. This was especially the work of a man called Majlisi towards the end of the 17th century, who was appointed Shaykh al-Islam, that is to say, religious leader of the country. Thereafter, he practically ran the country. He used his position to take out Sufism, falsafa, and alien creeds, meaning Christianity and Judaism, and to establish the so-called principal version of Twelver orthodoxy as the sole legitimate religious way. He launched an intellectual crusade against Sufism and philosophy. Majlisi brought the religious establishment under the central direction of the jurists, and especially of the senior mujtahid. They appealed to the religious sentiments of the masses by sanctioning the ritual commemoration of the sufferings of Imam Hussein. From now on, Shiism in Iran would mean adherence to the revealed texts as interpreted by Twelver tradition, up to and including the well-qualified jurists of the present day. And I think we can see here the background to Iran at the present, because the ulama, the mullahs, and the well-qualified jurists gained great social prestige. And after the Safavids declined in the early 18th century, there was really political chaos or very feeble sultans, and the real people who held society together and represented the people's interests, if you like, were the religious leaders with their hierarchy of authority. And this, I think, played into events in the last century. Well, I turn now to the Ottomans, who I think are by far the most fascinating dynasty there's ever been in the Muslim community. Fascinating in all sorts of ways. They were in power from the end of the 13th century till 1922, when they collapsed after the First World War, at the same time as the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was unprecedented and unequaled in the Islamic world in size and duration, extended from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Russian steppe to the Sahara, including the core regions of what we call the Middle East. No other state before or since controlled this particular collection of regions. The Ottomans were remarkably pragmatic in politics and inventive. They developed a new army based on the Janissaries, the new troops, and a new kind of bureaucracy. And this was based on the recruitment from outside Islam itself of non-Muslim youths, particularly from the Balkans, who of course were converted to Islam as youths, and then became the personal servants of the Sultan. And the great advantage of this was that here was a bureaucracy which had no independent power base, whereas anybody from within Muslim society or Turkish society would have had family connections and various things which could have been a challenge. But these people had no independence whatsoever. This was the so-called forced levy, or devshirme. It brought youths from the newly conquered parts of Europe, Thrace, Macedonia, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, into the heart of the Ottoman military and administrative system. It ensured that at least some senior posts were in the hands of dedicated personal servants of the Sultan with no independent power base. It also gave the Ottoman elite a partly European component, making this a kind of Eurasian polity. It gave the bureaucracy a partly meritocratic character. One European visitor remarked, "In making his appointments, the Sultan pays no regard to any pretensions on the score of wealth or rank. It is by merit that men rise. Honours, high posts, judgeships are rewards of ability and good service." In fact, when the empire began to suffer setbacks in the 17th century, some of the first reform treatises written by members of the devshirme, of the alien, if you like, bureaucracy, said, "The trouble now is that the emperor is allowing Turks and Jews into positions of high authority. We should only have members of the devshirme. Bring back the devshirme. What we want is your loyal Thracians, Albanians, Bosnians and Greeks in service." An extraordinary statement if you put it into the 20th century. This so-called Devleti Ali Osman, the rule of the House of Osman, was a religious polity. It was assumed that the purpose of the Sultan and his servants was to maintain din ve devlet, religion and dynasty or regime. The ulama were given for the first time a formal structure and a hierarchical system. The symbiosis rested on the Sultan himself, who was at once military commander, head of the Islamic people, and supreme civil authority, head of the bureaucracy. A parallel religious bureaucracy was headed by the Sheikh al-Islam, an office which was upgraded by the Ottomans. He was appointed and could be dismissed by the Sultan. His rulings on religious law, fatwas, were binding. Under him came the chief judges and then the qadis of major cities. The ulama were more free than other subjects from government interference. They were a kind of self-authorizing element in the polity. Leading families came to monopolize these religious positions, but they weren't in the bureaucracy. Religion provided the strongest bond between government and subjects, between what were called the ruling classes and the common people. That is, between those who lived off tax revenues and those who paid taxes. The Ottoman state also made allies of folk Islam and the Sufi orders. This showed the multifaceted strength of Islam as a religion of social control, as well as the skill of the Ottomans. Sufism had been the highway for many ordinary people from Christianity to Islam. The Sufis' religious missions permeated rural and urban society and the army. The Janissaries were devotees of the Bektashi order. Sufi orders quickly became part of the social cement, providing a welcome dose of political quietism. The keystone of this interlocking of state and religion was the religious judge, the Qadi. And they administered not only the Sharia, but a secular code known as the Qanun, to which we'll come in a moment. This extension of the Qadi's role into non-religious spheres was, quoting a scholar, the main innovation of Ottoman public law. In applying the Sharia, they had little discretion, since, clearly, the entire body of law was perfectly known to the litigants. There were no secrets and no surprises. Military governors enforced the decisions of the religious courts. The Ottomans underwrote, in other words, the Sharia order of society by ensuring that the Qadi's decisions were enforced. The close integration of the ulama into government brought benefits to both. It gave the ulama power and wealth. It gave the regime a ready-made legal and administrative framework with roots deeply embedded in popular belief. Behind this what I would call patrimonial absolutism lay the conviction that the Sultan's main duty was to implement justice. This involved his role as caliph as well. As somebody said, he is the writer of justice on the pages of time. Justice here, in particular, meant protecting the common people from the nobles. To achieve the goals of justice and order, the Sultan was entitled and encouraged to exercise both severity and mercy. The people should be made to live, as somebody said, between fear and hope. Severity was often advocated as being the best deterrent. Strictly speaking, as we know, Islam rejected the notion of absolute sovereignty. In theory, the Sultan's power was limited by the Sharia and by the decisions of Qadis. But few rulers could have had greater opportunities for infringement of norms in private without public attention. Success in jihad was once again irrefutable proof of political legitimacy. One of the early Ottomans was called the great and magnificent Emir, the warrior of the holy wall, Sultan of the frontier warriors, hero of the world. The Ottomans claimed to have received the sword of Uthman, the third rightly guided deputy, which actually can still be seen in the Topkapi Palace, if indeed that's what it is. The continued advance of Islam from east to west was seen as, quote, clear proof that God aided them and that Islam was the true religion. Now, the greatest innovation of the Ottoman state, as I said, was the development of Qanun, the non-religious law. This went back to the early monarchies. I think even the Umayyads, certainly the Abbasids, introduced a subsidiary form of law to supplement the Sharia, which was thought to be too lenient on some matters and not to cover everything. And this was known Qanun, as Qanun. In Ottoman times, it was known as also customary law or Ottoman law. And the great ruler whom we refer to as Suleiman the Magnificent, in the middle of the 16th century, more or less contemporary with our Queen Elizabeth here, was known to the Ottomans as Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman the legislator. They slotted the Qanun into the Sharia system. Both types of law, as we said, were administered by the same courts. This was partly based on a self-conscious respect for the Turco-Mongol tradition of popular law. A great deal of their legitimacy also rested on this claim to Mongol ancestry. And interestingly, unlike the Sharia, the Qanun applied to all subjects, whatever their religion. It dealt with criminal law. As I say, it was intended to supplement the Sharia by specifying penalties, sometimes mitigating it, more often stipulating harsher punishments. The Sheikh al-Islam and other muftis invoked the public interest, a religious principle, and public order as justifications for occasional harsh measures. So the most distinctive feature of the Ottoman system was the way it integrated the Sharia and the Qanun. And we shall see that one response to the decline of Ottoman power, in particular the military defeats of the 17th century, was to say, once again, we're not being pious enough, we must get rid of Qanun, we must only have the Sharia. The fusion of religion power had catastrophic effect on intellectual activity. Mehmed the Conqueror, who conquered Byzantium, captured Byzantium, had encouraged mathematics, science and astronomy, attracted scholars from Central Asia and Eastern Anatolia to his court. With his prestige as the conqueror, he could afford to be tolerant and indulge intellectual curiosity. But his successor was maneuvered into executing his father's librarian, who was an outstanding mathematician. Orthodox-minded ulama could charge anyone who showed independence of mind, especially if they criticized the ulama, with heresy or unbelief. In such a case, the Sultan, if he were to maintain his status as a religious leader, had to be seen to act. Sufis were occasionally persecuted. Suleiman I, that's the Qanuni, ordered governors to build a mosque in every village and to execute anyone who expressed doubts about the Quran. And then, in 1580, an observatory just outside Istanbul, as modern as any Europe, just 3 years after it was built, was destroyed on the orders of the Sheikh al-Islam. This was one result of an increasing dependence of the Sultanate upon Sunni orthodoxy as its source of legitimacy. Scientific and philosophical personnel and institutions were almost on a level with taverns and prostitutes. They might be tolerated or they might not. The pious strand in public opinion required that they be closed down from time to time, and it is easier to reopen a brothel than it is to rebuild an observatory. This absence of political theory was one of the most striking features of the Ottoman Empire. It may be contrasted with the wealth of ideas under the Abbasids and the Seljuks, and even under the Safavids and the Mughals. The fact that the political originality of the Ottomans was not reflected in ideas had an effect, I think, on the way they dealt with crisis problems when they occurred. It left the way open for opposition by the religious establishment to any non-Shari practices, especially secular law, and for the Islamization of the polity, which happened in the 18th century. We may say that political development withered for want of a conceptual framework. One response to military defeats was stricter enforcement of religious rules. Now, it was especially in the Ottoman domains that a new relationship developed between Islam and the West, based upon a recognition of the emerging technological, economic, and military superiority of the West. This resulted in loss of territory, reconquest by Christian rulers of parts of the Balkans and north of the Black Sea. What is interesting is the Ottomans' reaction to this. At first, some advocated more Qanun, as we saw, more devshirme. But very soon, the cry was for a stricter application of the Sharia, and there were renewed calls for the abolition of secular law. Finally, in the 18th century began a movement which in retrospect looks extremely significant, known as the Tanzimat or Reform. Owing to international relations and international politics, the sultans issued two decrees of reform, one in 1839, one in 1856, during the Crimean War, at which time, incidentally, Britain and France were allied with the Ottomans against Russia. And these decrees were aimed at improving the situation, in particular, of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, whatever the reasons, in the Tanzimat of 1839, for the first time, an official decree in the House of Islam adopted the language of European political thought. It was partly aimed at securing British and French support by demonstrating the liberalizing intentions of the Ottoman government, especially towards its Christian subjects. The further decree of 1856 was also aimed specifically at improving the position of religious minorities. But these measures were also, it's been said, based on, quote, a genuine belief that the only way to save the empire was to introduce European-style reforms. And these were justified on the ground that this was actually, at the same time, a fuller implementation of the original Islamic norms. In fact, the mottos put on a coin at the time in French, justice equal for all and protection of the weak, could either have come from Islamic tradition or the European Enlightenment. Well, I now want to turn to the Westernization developments in the late Ottoman Empire and Turkey. Here we encounter what one must call modern Islamic political thought, the first strand. And we encounter it in the form of modernism or reformism, i.e. the adoption of Western stuff. Modernism began with a group of thinkers in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century called the Young Ottomans. Their political ideals have been summed up by themselves as, quote, the sovereignty of the nation, the separation of powers, the responsibility of officials, personal freedom, equality, freedom of thought, freedom of the press, freedom of association, enjoyment of property, sanctity of the home. The young Ottomans explicitly combined Westernization with Islamic idealism, and they gave coherent reasons for doing so by equating the political language of Islam with that of modern liberalism and parliamentary democracy. As one scholar puts it, for them, Ummet meant nation, Ijma meant social contract, Bayat meant the delegation of sovereignty by the people to the ruler, Ijtihad meant parliamentary legislation. They developed a technique for reinterpreting texts from the Quran and Hadith as arguments for constitutional democracy. For example, the saying, so pardon your brothers and take counsel with them in the affair, and the Hadith from the Quran, and the Hadith, difference of opinion within my community is an act of divine mercy, were given as arguments for parliamentary government. So was the traditional juristic principle of consensus, ijma, of the community. All this was a distinctive and original development in Islamic political thought. It would lead to a rethinking of political values, past and present. The European ideals of parliamentary liberalism were, in their opinion, both good in themselves and in accordance with the essential tenets of Islam. They were morally superior to the norms and institutions which for many centuries had counted as Islamic tradition, because that had departed radically from the Islamic ideal. What was needed was a return to what had been prescribed by true original Islam, namely constitutional and parliamentary government based on the sovereignty of the people. This was what was currently practiced in some European states. By equating the adoption of Western ways of thinking with a return to the first principle of Islam, the young Ottomans became the first Islamic modernists. This was to be taken up by liberal reformists in the 20th century. The young Ottomans further argued that, I quote, the provisions of the Sharia, were capable of alteration in accordance with the requirements of the time. They distinguished between a core or essence of Islamic beliefs and the way these had been spelled out under specific historical circumstances. They were thus able to argue that rather than taking over Western legal systems, one should apply the spirit of the Sharia to modern conditions. This, too, was an approach which came to be adopted by 20th century liberal Muslims and Islamists. There was one problem which is shared by Christians in a modern society, and this is what happens if Parliament legislates contrary to what one believes is right. Does one go with the majority or follow the religious right? A case in point in many Western countries would be abortion, which is usually opposed in particular by Christians and quite frequently permitted. So that, I think, is the problem with this position. But also, the young Ottomans took one further, I think, very important step, which was in supporting full civil rights for non-Muslims. Well, now this was, in a sense, the background to the Turkish Revolution of 1920 to 1924. That is to say, public opinion had to some extent been softened up in that way, and then you got the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War by the Western powers, and defeat incurs a threat of losing political legitimacy, which it did. But there was, of course, one exception to this, and that was the great general Mustafa Kemal, who defeated the British, famously at Gallipoli, and who was undefeated. And he thus was able to make an entirely credible bid for power, and it so happened he was a thoroughgoing Westernizer, and as you know, he set up the modern Republic of Turkey on completely secular principles. The Sharia was abolished, a whole lot of Muslim social customs were forbidden, and the whole thing was supposed to be completely secularized. The new legal system was adopted, which remarkably was based on Swiss law, which was partly based on Roman law, which had been codified in Byzantium in the 6th century. So that's a historical irony for you. The Turkish Revolution was as momentous as the Russian one of 1917 to 21, but Western historians and social scientists have paid it less attention. It was a defining moment in the relationship between Islam and the state. It brought into being the first avowedly secular state in the Muslim world, and it forced former subjects of the Ottoman Empire, in particular the Arabs of the Middle East, to find a new political identity. Under the Turkish Republic, the jurisdiction of religious judges was abolished. Religious colleges were abolished. The new law included equality in marriage between female and male and the right to change one's faith. But, as we all know, all of this and the relationship between religion and the state in Turkey is now very much contestable. Well, that's the end of that, and in the next talk I will turn to the modern stroke recent stroke contemporary Islamic political thought. Well, perhaps I should begin by remarking that Islamic political thought in the 19th and 20th centuries was defined by its relationship with the West, either as a model of how societies could and should develop, or as an other and enemy. Islamic intellectuals reacted to the challenges of European science and material development and the tremors which these had set off across the Islamic world, either on the one hand by syncretism, justified by seeing certain Western ideas as expressions of true Islam, or on the other hand by revivalism, going back to the sources of revelation. Both reformism or modernism and Islamism or fundamentalism, I would actually say fundamentalism is just a branch of Islamism, were driven by the experience of Europe's technical and military superiority and its economic penetration and exploitation. They may be defined, these movements, and tended to define themselves by their relationship to the West. Modernism, as we saw, was an adaptation of religious ideas and practices to take account of what the West had achieved and to improve on it. Islamism, including fundamentalism, was a return to a supposedly original core Islamic praxis as a way of overcoming the West. It developed after modernizing reformism, but has not replaced it. Today, both movements are, of course, alive and thriving. Each involved analysis and reappraisal of Islamic and European cultural histories. Both shared an agenda to revive Islam by going back to its first principles as set out in the Quran and parts of the Sunnah, which they interpreted differently. But one ultimate objective both shared was to get rid of Western hegemony. Where they differed was that modernism identified some of Islam's basic principles as identical to the political values of European parliamentary liberalism, values which had become submerged in Islamic countries due to despotism, and which it was alleged Europe had borrowed from Islam. Now, I would like just to make two remarks about political culture, which may relate to the way politics is conducted in some Muslim-majority countries, particularly perhaps in the Middle East. 20th century states in the Muslim world differ, broadly speaking, from Western states in the strength of traditional networks throughout the civil society over which they rule. That is to say, so far as I can see, and I've found others say this, social membership and obligation tend to run in family clans, sects large and small, Muslim and non-Muslim, local districts and tribes. It has been said that in the heyday of secular ideology, i.e. in the mid-20th century, about 60 years ago, quote, the categories of political action, whether observed in Syria, Iraq, or the Yemen, remained the traditional ones of Jama'at groups, Qutal factions, and Fiat cliques. Political parties serve as the instruments of such units, or of the state, or the ruler. Politics and social life in general tend to depend upon a patronage system in which people are grouped into families, quarters, villages, sects, and tribes which have, quote, stifled the emergence of class and interest groups. That's from Chueri. Familial and hereditary factors operate at the pinnacle of state authority, notably in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf sheikdoms, which somebody has described as no more than the private property of individual families, and the hereditary monarchies of Jordan and Morocco. Such traditional units in many cases constitute the power base of governments, as you see obviously in Assad's so-called Syria. On the other hand, nationhood, differently from what I've been saying, has created, I think, a sense of common membership in states such as Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, I think. The second point I would make is just to suggest, without perhaps exaggerating it, the importance of the military in many Muslim majority states, the importance of the role of the military. Muslim majority states, anyway, west of the Himalayas, there's been a marked tendency to form a close relationship between the military and the government, whether they're secular or more Muslim in orientation. Either because the ruler is also the commander of the armed forces, as in many traditional Islamic states, or because a military leader takes over the government, as has happened in Pakistan at various times. We saw the importance of military success to legitimacy in the case of Mustafa Kemal. So that's just a suggestion. Now, I want to start by saying something. Oh, sorry, I've made a mistake here. Sorry, I've just got to find my way here. Yeah, here we go. I want to start by saying a few words about Islamists, including, and perhaps particularly, what we would call fundamentalists. Islamists began to argue that a comprehensive, at least this is how I would define them, and precise blueprint for an Islamic state, quite different from anything that could be found in the recent past or at any time since early Islam, could in fact be discovered in the founding texts of Islam if one looked hard enough. The question we need to ask, or one question, is to what extent the ideology of so-called fundamentalism is new within Islam and not, as they themselves see it, a revival of ancient virtue. In Zubayda's view, quote, fundamentalism is modern and can best be understood in terms of the concepts and assumptions of modern political ideas associated with the nation and the nation state. He finds the influence, however unconscious, of the West in the conception of the people as a political entity and in party structures which appear somewhat Leninist, i.e. authoritarian parties. Nazi Ayubi, on the other hand, has argued that the very belief, quote, that Islam is by its very nature a political religion is of recent origin. The ideas of going back to the sources, to the fundamentals, of reviving a golden age, I would suggest is as old as Islam itself. Appeals for mass political action resting on the concept of one universal ummah have been made time and again from the 9th century onwards. So I would say it's not that new. Further, while it is true that there's often been a separation between religion and government, as we've seen in practice, this has never been canonized as the correct theory or the correct doctrine. Many Muslims have throughout history seen political power as a necessary part of their political project. I think al-Mawadi and Ibn Taymiyya are obvious examples of that. Well now, if we come to what we call Islamism today, I suppose the founding moment is the foundation of the Society of Muslim Brethren by Hassan al-Banna, a disciple of al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu, in 1928 in Egypt. This, many would see as a new departure in Islamic political thought and practice. Now, the original aim, as I understand it, was to educate people, to raise their standard of living, and to spread the message of an Islamic order, al-Nizam al-Islami. Al-Banna and his followers reaffirmed, and this is interesting, the all-embracing vision of Islam as covering political, social and economic life. As he stated, Islam is a faith and a ritual, a nation, watan, and a nationality, a religion and a state, spirituality and action, Quran and sword. At the same time, they reaffirmed the ideal of the caliph as the head of a universal Islamic community. These ideas seem to me as a historian to tap into a long-standing Muslim approach. We saw it, I believe, in early Islam and later in, for example, Ibn Taymiyya. It is very difficult to reject this approach without a massive reinterpretation of the sources and tradition, which some people do undertake, as we'll see. Now, it's also been said that the Brethren represent a new type of Islamic community, as somebody has called it, the first mass-supported and organized, essentially urban-oriented effort to cope with the plight of Islam in the modern world. I would say Ibn Hanbal was doing the same in 9th century Baghdad. Members of the Brethren swore an oath of loyalty to the leader, hence the connotation by Zubaydah of Leninist, but the Brethren did not advocate violence. One could only build an Islamic society and state when people accepted their message, in other words, by democratic means. Then I would turn to al-Maududi in India, in the subcontinent. He, on the other hand, taught, or partly on the other hand, taught that in order to achieve an Islamic society modelled on what had been revealed to Muhammad, one has to get hold of political power. Ibn Taymiyyah again. Quote, among the factors that influence human morality and civilization, the strongest is government. I'm not sure that's true. What ultimately determines human advance or decline is the identity of those who exercise control, but one can see why he said it. Again, quote, the nature of the Islamic faith itself requires that the Muslim should concentrate all his effort upon wresting leadership from unbelieving and corrupt men to entrust it to the righteous. So the identity of those in power is all important. Maududi also developed a new type of political organization, actually more Leninist than the Brethren, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which some of you will know much more about than I do. He looked to a moral and intellectual elite, not a mass organization. As he says, there must exist a righteous community devoted to the sole purpose of realizing the system of truth. Like several reformers inspired by religion in this period, including some in the West, he condemned political parties. But I suspect that the most influential expression of Islamism and fundamentalism today has been that of Sayyid Qutb, born in Egypt in 1906, died in Cairo in prison, or just after release from prison, in 1966. A poet and teacher, and one of the most original thinkers of the 20th century. Anywhere. According to him, and this is typical, the Quran contains all anybody needs to know. Quote, Islam altogether presents to mankind an example of a political system the like of which has never been found in any of the other systems known to the world. Therefore, Islam has nothing to learn from the West. That is the main point there. He visited America and didn't like it. Islamic and Western values are fundamentally different. Islam, he says, proposes independent solutions to human problems. Islam is a comprehensive philosophy and a homogeneous unity, and to introduce into it any foreign element would mean ruining it. For him, once again, the principal means of achieving his goal is missionary teaching. violence is advocated only in response to violence by the state, that is to say, only when preaching is forbidden. When freedom of speech is denied, only then is physical jihad justified. Many Western thinkers have said exactly the same. Only when the masses are converted to correct Islamic views could an Islamic state be set up. In other words, once again, it's got to be democratic. Further, Qutb, like most modernists and Islamists, hold that Islam's teachings about human relationships and the social order are not fixed in the canonized ancient jurisprudence. The Quran can and should be interpreted anew. The point is, by whom and how? Here, Qutb seems to me to have been quite radical. The Quran, he said, and I think I'm right, he wrote this in Nasser's prison, should be read as poetry. Islam has its own unique methodology, quote, characterized by vitality, tone, direct touch, and allusion. It is allusion to the great truths which are not represented by words but alluded to by words, like a poem. As a modern scholar puts it, in this view, Islam is a conception, an idea, an intuition, a vision. It seems as if the touchstone of correct understanding is the sensibility of the individual. This, of course, makes interpretation of the Quran pretty subjective. Truth, and therefore authority, derive from a personal aesthetic vision. He stands, obviously, in the tradition of pure revelationism, but he gives it a new meaning, advocating direct, personal, and intuitive understanding of revelation, as he says. If man is left alone to his own conscience and soul, with the help of religion, he will be able to acquire an adequate understanding of the universe. That's Sayyid Qutb. I find that a little reminiscent of Ghazali. Now, recently and for some time, Islamists, including fundamentalists, or most fundamentalists, as well as modernists, say they support democracy and liberty, and frequently that they support human rights. The crucial question throughout seems to me to be, however, what about non-Muslims? Are they part of the democracy? Do they have liberty? It's very easy to grant liberty to those who agree with you. It's very easy for democracy to acquire a somewhat different meaning in a context when it is assumed that everyone is a believer. Not only are the people usually, if not always quite explicitly, Muslims, but their scope of action, like that of the caliphs and sultans of old, is always limited by the Sharia. The Tunisian Rashid Ghannouchi defends this because he thinks Islam improves upon Western-style democracy by underpinning it with a proper moral code. The legislative scope of Parliament is limited in their model, is limited by the Sharia because the Sharia is a divinely legislated code. The crucial question is, once again, who determines what the Sharia is? Now, Noah Feldman, a scholar who's written a remarkable book called The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, suggests that there is uncertainty about identifying who is in charge of specifying the meaning of the Sharia. One development in Muslim political theory has been to give this function to an elected legislature, thus making the interpretation of the Sharia democratic. This is an original approach. As Feldman points out, Muslims would here be, quote, Feldman, adopting an experimental approach of democratizing the Sharia by calling on the legislature to draw upon it in passing laws. Or again, the mainstream Sunni Islamist position is that a democratically elected legislature should draft and pass laws to incorporate the content of Islamic law. When necessary, it should use its discretion to decide how best to legislate in accordance with Islamic values. Feldman argues that this is rather like what Western states do when they draw up, say, a Bill of Rights or a constitution which is binding on all governments as underpinning and delimiting what a state may do, a fundamental law. I don't see this. The Sharia, as advocated by these people, seems to be much more explicit in detail than any Western-style constitution. And above all, it surely differentiates between categories of citizen depending upon their religious belief, which is anathema to all current Western notions of legality. One last point. It seems to me that Islamist, or at least fundamentalist, constitutional thought is characterized, when it comes to procedures, by a remarkable lack of detail. Sometimes authors dismiss the details of constitutions as, quote, futile arguments about mere technicalities. As Nazi Ayubi summarizes their view, one may search the manifestos of the Muslim Brethren or the Iranian clerics for a detailed description of what an Islamic state or an Islamic economy should look like, but such a search will be in vain. The Muslim Brethren, at first, said they would leave, quote, the specifics to quote, time, place, and the needs of the people. According to Qutb, quote, the form of government based on the principles of Islam is not of vital importance. In theory, it is a matter of indifference whether the Islamic State has a republican or other form of government. So that's a major, major difference from Western political thought, where it's very often insisted that it is all important that you specify the constitution in great detail. For Said Qutb, the goodness of the state does not depend on its institutions, but on its underlying principles. This is partly due to an implicit belief that moral principles and the virtue of those in power are what really matter, that once these are settled, everything else will fall into place. Qutb thought that once the heart is freed from human subjection and subjected to the governance of God alone, everything will be all right. As Chueri comments, this aversion to discuss concrete politics has become the hallmark of contemporary Islamic radicalism. Well, now I want to turn to the other point of view, namely that of what we call the modernists. On the other hand, and now I'm looking at the other end of the spectrum, the modernists, the reformists. And I think the most distinguishing feature of these comes from those few who have argued to the contrary, that the Prophet did not lay down any form of government, had perhaps no political agenda, was a purely religious spiritual leader analogous to Jesus. This, of course, would point to a separation between religion and state. This seems first to have been suggested by none other than Muhammad Abduh. For him, I quote a commentator, I quote him, political organization is not a matter determined by Islamic doctrine, but is rather determined from time to time, according to circumstances, by general consultation within the community. Muhammad Abduh. Now, as many of you will know, this point was argued by Abd al-Razik in Egypt in about 1922, just at the time and in response to the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate. He, whereas Rashid Rida promptly appealed for a restoration of a newly organized caliphate, Abd al-Razik, who was a teacher at the Al-Azhar University, argued that Islam did not lay down a precise order of argument. He argued, as argue he must, being a Muslim and a teacher, by reinterpreting the data of Islamic revelation. Muhammad did not set out to establish a state and did not lay down any particular political system. Here, as one author has put it, we meet for the first time a consistent, unequivocal theoretical assertion of the purely and exclusively religious character of Islam. In this, he was following the spirit of Christian Western biblical criticism in the sense that he was prepared to countenance the possibility that prevailing tradition had radically misinterpreted its own sources. Islam, he said, has nothing to do with the caliphate as the Muslims understand it, therefore it was not necessary to restore it. The rules which the Prophet laid down concerned spiritual matters such as prayer and fasting. All of those apparently political actions, even warfare, are means for the Prophet to establish the religion and promulgate his religious call. Abd al-Razik thus took the modernist argument that the social norms of the Sharia could be changed because they derived from specific historical circumstances, an important stage further. The caliphate itself was the product of history, an institution of human rather than divine origin, a temporary convenience, and therefore a purely political office with no intrinsic religious meaning or function. The universality of Islam lay not in its political structure, but in its faith and religious guidance. As one commentator has put it, Abd al-Razik's aim was, nonetheless, like that of all modernists and most reformers, to enable Islamic countries to develop politically so that they could compete with other nations on equal terms. Now, this clearly meant that constitutional forms could be remolded from top to bottom. In political matters, we should be guided by reason and experience. As Abd al-Razik put it, all political functions are left to us, our reason, its judgments, and political principles. Religion neither commands nor forbids such things. It simply leaves them to us so that in respect of them we have recourse to the laws of reason, the experience of nations, and the rules of politics. Muslims have absolute freedom to organize the state in accordance with existing intellectual, social, and economic conditions. Now, there's an interesting addition to this in a Turkish sociologist, Ziya Gökalp, of about the same period, early 20th century. He argued for a separation between religion and the state on the basis of Emil Durkheim's theory of social evolution. In the primitive state of social solidarity, the different aspects of society, religion, polity, culture, and law, do indeed all go together. But it is an essential feature of organic solidarity, which characterizes the modern condition, that these should be separated out. therefore such a change is legitimate, he would say. Now, sorry, I'm going to start. To reconcile the separation of religion and state in terms compatible with Islamic doctrine seems to me to require a fundamental change in the way one approaches the very sources of religious knowledge, namely in the interpretation of the Quran. It required, it seems to me, reassessment of what counts as a political argument. All political argument by and among Muslims has at some point, it seems to me, to be articulated or justified in terms of the Quran. The Hadith and the Sunnah could be radically reinterpreted, but this was more difficult in the case of the Quran. To question its veracity or authenticity was and is to declare oneself an unbeliever. Any other ideas or methodology, appeals to empirical data, for example, have at some point in the discussion to be demonstrated to be not out of step with what God has revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in that text. To say that this constrained political argument would be an understatement. This so-called hermeneutic issue of interpretation is, in my view, the really decisive one. And a very remarkable development here took place in the thinking of two individuals whom I want to spend a moment looking at. They are Mohammed Taha, who was a Sudanese engineer who became a spiritual leader in the early 1970s, and An-Naim, who now lives in America, who was his pupil. Taha suggested a distinction between two phases in the Prophet's career, the Meccan and the Medinan. And he ascribed parts of the Quran to the first stage at Mecca, other parts to the second stage at Medina. I have no idea with what historical validity. He said that the former Meccan phase of the revelation to Muhammad was the fundamental one, thus quite different to, remember, al-Shafi'i, who said later statements override earlier ones. The later Medinan phase, and of course the whole subsequent development of the Sunnah, was a secondary adaptation to the needs of the time. Not incorrect, but not of everlasting truth, to put it simply. All the political and pugnacious elements of Islamic theory, along with all the detailed prescriptions of Muslim law, were contained, in his view, in this second and inferior stage. Taha held that the texts which are cited in support of, quote, jihad, slavery, capitalism, gender inequality, polygyny, all come from the Medinan period and are for that reason not applicable today. The first phase was superior because it represented what Muhammad had originally wanted to proclaim, while the second stage represented behavioral strategies forced upon Muhammad and his companions by the exigencies of events. Today, he means, the time is right for a return to the first original phase of Muhammad's message. Now, An-Naim, Taha's most articulate follower, summarizes his views as follows, quote, Islam was offered first in tolerant and egalitarian terms in Mecca, where the Prophet preached equality and individual responsibility between all men and women without distinction on grounds of race, sex, or social origin. As that message was rejected in practice, some aspects of the message changed in response to the socio-economic and political realities of the time. An-Naim urges the responsibility of believers to exercise ijtihad, which he equates with civic reason, on their own behalf. This is, of course, completely anti-legalist. That is, as Taha himself observed, it moves Islam away from Judaism, or away from similarity to Judaism, and towards similarity to Christianity. This revolutionary hermeneutic step taken by Taha and An-Na'im suggests that the same kind of historical and textual analysis can legitimately be applied to the founding text of Islam as Christians have been applying to the New Testament. Of course, such an approach is wide open to subjective interpretation. But the point for us here is that it enables Muslims to discuss politics and the state without constantly having to defer to the Quran. Without this, political thought among Muslims is in danger of becoming a collectively private language of no interest to anyone who does not believe that what we need to know about human affairs begins and ends with the Quran. This facilitates a fundamental and far-reaching change in Islamic political thought. I would say the most far-reaching there has ever been, whether you accept it or not. For the first time, it gives the textual Quranic initiative to humanitarian modernizers and liberal reformers. It becomes far easier to put forward a modern, liberal and/or socialist agenda within Islam. To say that the Quran is an ethical rather than a political text has repercussions on practically every aspect of political thought. Now, in his most recent work called Islam and the Secular State, An-Na'im goes further and argues the case for a secular state on religious grounds. For only if the state is devoid of religious bias will Muslims and others be able to believe in and practice their faith entirely voluntarily, which is the only way any religion can be genuinely practiced and believed in. Sharia principles, as he puts it, cannot by their nature and function be enforced by the state. Furthermore, only a secular state, can, quote, mediate relations between different communities, whether religious, anti-religious, or non-religious, that share the same political space. All of those we have looked at hitherto seem to me to imply, even if only by omission, significant reservations about freedom of expression and toleration for non-Muslims, whether they believe in one God or many, or in no God at all. They all seem to me to be unaware of the main arguments of John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. For example, that today's error should be tolerated because it may become tomorrow's truth. We can now appreciate the full moral and intellectual impact of the hermeneutic approach advocated by Taha and An-Na'im. An-Na'im's concept of the secular state gives freedom and toleration to believers and unbelievers of all kinds. Indeed, An-Na'im applies one of Mill's arguments for freedom of expression to religious discourse with specific reference to Islam. Quote, "Since it is impossible to know whether or not Muslims will accept or reject any particular view until it is openly and freely expressed and debated, it is necessary to maintain complete freedom of opinion, belief, and expression for such views to emerge and be propagated. The idea of prior censorship is therefore inherently destructive and counterproductive for the development of any Islamic doctrine or principle." The methodology of Taha and An-Na'im also puts the discourse of human rights on a different plane. Muslims have to see, says An-Na'im, that, quote, "the other person with whom they must identify and accept as their equal in human dignity and rights includes all other human beings, regardless of gender and religion. The principle of reciprocity stipulates equal rights for all citizens, be they Muslim or non-Muslim, female or male." Taha himself was particularly insistent upon equality between men and women. He saw this as the universal rule of Islam. Here, for the first time perhaps, we have Muslim political thinkers giving equal civic rights to unbelievers and not just people of the book. It removes the basis for distinguishing between the moral capabilities of Muslims and non-Muslims. It therefore removes a fundamental objection to giving them equal political rights. Right, thank you.